This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Keith Whittington his new book, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Keith Whittington is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He is the author of a number of books on constitutional law. I mentioned his three most recent: Constitutional Construction, Constitutional Interpretation, and Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy. Keith, glad to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Keith, you are obviously a well-known scholar, an award-winning scholar of the Constitution, of the judicial branch. You've published widely in that area. But why this interest? Why write a book on academic freedom?
Yeah, I think to some degree, it's something that I took for granted for a long time. I sort of assumed that both students and faculty sort of understood what universities were for and why they were there, and appreciated the kind of common project we were all working on. And in the past few years, I've become increasingly concerned that there were a lot of people on campus who didn't seem to really understand what universities are all about, and didn't necessarily contribute to them in positive ways. And I also worry that I think that the people outside of universities didn't necessarily appreciate what universities had to offer. And so it seemed like we really then ought to try to talk more explicitly about why universities matter, what kinds of values they ought to be committed to, and then what the implications for that might be for thinking about free speech controversies, in particular on college campuses.
So a central part of your case early in the book is to get free speech right on campus, to get free speech right in the classroom, to sort of get away from safe spaces or the political correctness or the, you can't say that because my identity and all of that sort of business. You say the university has to be clear on what it's about, on the mission of the institution itself. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one way of approaching these kinds of topics is to think that we have a set of constitutional rules that the Supreme Court has developed coming out of the First Amendment, and that constrains what state universities can do relative to free speech in general, and that's helpful. But I think it's limited, and I think undersells why those of us who live and work on college campuses ought to care about these kinds of issues. I think even private universities, as well as public universities, ought to care a great deal about protecting a wide scope for free-ranging debate and skeptical inquiry on college campuses, and I think, in particular, we ought to want to do that because of the core mission of the university, which ultimately is to attempt to expand the range of human knowledge, to push forward what it is we know and what we understand about the world and how it works, and then communicate what we've learned, and communicate it to fellow scholars, to communicate it to students, and ultimately communicate it to the general public. And all of that requires a commitment to universities being open to asking hard questions, questioning conventional wisdom, and following the trail of evidence and arguments wherever they might go. And we have to give, I think, faculty in particular, but ultimately students as well, the freedom on college campuses to pursue the truth as best they can.
So I take it, as I read your book, I think what you're saying is the free speech, but in a way there has to be a presupposition, or there has to be something that a university is about that isn't daily brought into question, namely the pursuit of knowledge. We know we're about the pursuit of knowledge, and that's why we're here. And so knowledge and teaching, research, instruction, teaching, something like that, that's what's beyond question. And to do that requires a great amount of liberty and requires sort of, the liberalness of mind and thought, the ability to weigh ideas, to consider them no matter what they are, in a spirit of not just freedom, but also some generosity to actually walk through an idea with someone before you condemn it, et cetera. And I take it, in making this case in the beginning of the book, you're saying that's the key ingredient missing on so many campuses.
I think that's right, although I would say it's beyond question. I think that too is open for debate, and it's a question that one can talk about on a college campus as to, well, why are we really here?
Yeah.
What is this institution really committed to? I think that for over 100 years, most American universities, as well as universities in much of the rest of the world, have seen themselves as fundamentally committed to this mission of trying to advance the state of knowledge and then communicate what we know to others. And I think that's a valuable mission. It's an important mission. It's created great benefits for American society in general. And so I hope that we continue to be committed to that kind of mission and continue to want our universities to pursue that kind of mission. But it's not crazy to question it. A lot of universities in the United States started off not really understanding themselves as pursuing that particular mission, and it's possible to imagine universities deciding, or some universities at least, deciding that they wanted to do something different, that they understood themselves to primarily being credentialing services for businesses, and they didn't care very much about the pursuit of truth per se. They really were just trying to stamp out workers for an advanced industrial economy. Or you can imagine universities that sort of understand themselves as just being committed to the indoctrination of a certain set of beliefs to the next generation. I think both those things would be a terrible transformation of American universities. But I think they should at least be on the table. We should be able to talk about that, just like we can talk about everything else on a university campus.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. I was reading your book. I was thinking of a book Robert Nisbet wrote, The Denigration of Academic Dogma. And he used dogma in the title because he says every institution to survive has to have a dogma. It has to have something that is above daily criticism and questioning. It's just true, and it's assumed to be true. And he said, with regard to the university, that has to be knowledge and instruction. That has to be the dogma of the modern American university. And I guess I wonder, as I read your book and think about your opening arguments, it led me to think, well, so what are, let's say Nisbet's right, what are the threats primarily to that? And one, now you talk a lot about, as a lot of people are, political correctness. I wonder also, does the American university even know what it is anymore? I mean, can we talk about it just in sort of general terms and scope, or is it? I mean, or is that just really the problem? It cannot be defined. It's such a sprawling collection of departments now.
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two kinds of issues about that. So one is that American higher education as a whole is extraordinarily diverse. Right? There's a tremendous number of institutions of higher education in the United States, and they're all very different. And so they do pursue slightly different missions. They understand their own purposes slightly differently, and so a Princeton University isn't necessarily the same as the University of Texas at Austin, where I was an undergraduate, and neither one of those is the same as a small liberal arts college or a teaching-oriented state university and the like. So different institutions are going to be somewhat different, but I do think that nonetheless they all tend to share this basic core commitment, even though how exactly they pursue it is a little different. But they all share a basic core commitment to thinking that what they ought to be about is advancing knowledge and then trying to communicate it. It's with possible exception, I think, of some religious institutions that would qualify that a little bit by saying, well, maybe we have a statement of faith that puts a boundary on what we're willing to question on this particular campus. I think there are a variety of threats, though, to that, and some of them come from inside the universities and some of them come from outside the universities. I think universities over the course of the last century or so, as they've been committed to that core mission, have also increasingly become larger and more open to a wider range of students. And a lot of those students, of course, come to the university with the primary goal of trying to position themselves to have a better life, to get a better kind of job, and make economic advances. And so they're very focused on the material benefits the university has to offer, rather than necessarily thinking, directly about the scholarly benefits of what a university has to offer. Of course, a lot of students are spending time on campus at least part of the time having fun, and universities have dedicated themselves to, I think, an excessive degree to maintaining, large sporting activities on campus and entertainment activities on campus to keep students amused. And there's also, of course, some pressure to say that maybe there are some questions that really just ought to be off the table on universities. And as you say, it could be characterized as kind of political correctness, and it could be characterized as in other kinds of ways. But there's certainly some on university campuses that think that there ought to be a kind of dogma on campus. There ought to be certain questions that shouldn't be asked because we should take on faith certain kinds of value commitments or political commitments, and we should be very reluctant to allow people on campus to question those.
What do your thoughts? You've having studied this issue. When you think about political correctness, seems to go hand in glove with sort of an identity politics, and is sort of this, as I see it, words are an attempt to prove your identity. They're projections, they're weapons. They are an attempt suffused with the meaning you choose to give them. So it seems to me there's sort of a nihilism at the core there that sort of informs this sort of totalizing egalitarianism. Why do you think that's been so successful on so many campuses in America?
Well, I think partially it's successful because there's a kernel of truth in it, that words have consequences, ideas have consequences, and speech is one of the tools that we use to construct a social world, and including systems of power and influence and authority. And so I think some of that scholarship that has pushed on those particular questions has, I think, correctly called our attention to the fact that some ideas and some ways of thinking about the world, sometimes in ways they're not very examined and just sort of taken as sort of part of the as assumed features of the world that we live in, have genuine consequences in creating social hierarchies and the like. And maybe we ought to look at those things more self-consciously. Sometimes we ought to object to the ways in which we've constructed power dynamics and social hierarchies in our particular society, and we ought to try to think about ways of subverting them or changing them. So I think there's a kernel of truth in some of those kinds of theories, and that has made them attractive. But it's also possible to run too far with that, and I think there certainly are people on campus who start thinking that arguments and ideas and words are nothing but a system of domination, and a system for reinforcing certain kinds of hierarchies, and moreover, there's it's not possible to get behind them or question them or examine them in any kind of fairly objective way. And instead, everything just becomes a battle of wills over which set of ideas are going to dominate. And I think that ought to be very discouraging for what it is universities are ultimately about, if it just becomes a place where we have political battles through the proxy of words.
Thinking about, you talked about sort of the incredible diversity in higher education in America just now, and I've thought, isn't that, in a way, that should be the goal of, okay, if that is our tradition, if that is, what we have due to various, features of American life that produce these institutions, how do we preserve that? It seems to me that diversity, which religious colleges, the land grant colleges, major universities, liberal arts colleges, all these sorts of things come into being, And what is really the threat to that? And I think of a couple, but it seems to me one thing that doesn't get discussed enough is sort of the way in which regulation, federal regulation, accreditations, the sort of administrative bloat, the way that increased costs at the expense, I think, of teaching, and increasingly crowds out, um, with senior faculty in favor of adjuncts. All of that seems to, in my mind, to be an equal, if not greater, threat to the political correctness game that's also going on.
Yeah, I think there's no question there are a variety of threats to the way higher education works in the United States and the future of universities. And so I think those who want to play up sort of the crisis of free speech on college campuses as being sort of the single greatest threat to universities are overplaying the problem. I think free speech is a problem on campus, and it's connected to a problem of understanding what it is we're supposed to be doing on college campuses. But it's certainly not the only challenge on college campuses. And some of those challenges are fundamentally economic. Universities are expensive to run. They have become more expensive, and some of those expenses is a function of decisions that have been made on campuses themselves to have administrative bloat and to expend resources on various things. But some of it's a function of outside forces like regulations that have forced universities to spend a lot of money and organize themselves in particular kinds of ways. And some of that has homogenizing effects that makes it more difficult for universities to have a distinctive profile and do things differently because they're all subject to grants and regulations that tend to impose uniformity. I think there's also just social pressures for a kind of homogenization of what universities have to offer. So while there's some real uses to something like U.S. News ranking of universities, for example, there's a real downside, and one of the downsides is that it tends to want to say, well, all universities are basically the same. They just exist on a single dimension of best to worst, and instead of thinking about universities as being potentially unique and having distinctive features, and some are going to be a particularly good fit for certain students with certain kinds of goals and aspirations, and others are going to be better fits for other students. And so that kind of pressure, I think, as well, sort of leads universities to want to say, well, we all have to chase after the exact same set of students, and we're all trying to make ourselves as much alike as possible in order to minimize the perceived differences. And that's, I think, ultimately destructive of what American universities can be.
Talk about your thoughts on the humanities overall in American higher education. Do you see them? What role do you see them not playing that they should be playing on campus, or or you think they're doing a good job? And I'm thinking, as I ask this question, I keep reading about the declining number of students that want to major in a humanities program, and I can think of a very practical reason for that, which is higher education has become so expensive. You're actually looking for a precise marketable skill that you think literature or history may not give you. But I ask that question also because it seems humanities themselves don't believe, or many professors in the humanities don't seem to actually believe in a centralizing or civilizing mission that they're supposed to bring. And in the sense also of carrying forward a tradition of thought and learning.
Yeah, I think both those things are right. That there's been a decline in number of students interested in humanities majors, in part because they also have a wider set of options than they once did. So there's been an expansion of other fields of study, including in the hard sciences and engineering, including social sciences, and that's sort of drawn some students away from the humanities. Also, students are increasingly choosing not to study the humanities, and I do think that a very hard-headed calculation about the cost of going to college and what it is students are trying to get out of college has sort of led them to focus on degrees that they think are going to have an immediate economic payoff to them. And humanities have not always been effective at explaining what students can do with those degrees, how they can be translated into a successful future career, and so students find themselves looking for things that it's sort of more obvious what the payoff and connections are to the job market. And so humanities suffer from that. I think it's also true that humanities are not always as appealing to students as they might once have been, and some of it's because the humanities are a little uncertain. And each discipline is a little different, but I think there is some uncertainty there as to what they think they ought to be doing and what it is they have to offer to students. I think some students still find humanities studies in humanities extraordinarily exciting, and do see a great deal of intellectual payoff to studying in those fields, and sometimes it's connected to very traditional things, like has this kind of civilizing influence, and it's a ability to experience a long history of thought in which people have struggled to understand the human condition, and students sometimes can find that very appealing and want to engage in that same conversation. But also, it's true that some of the things that people sometimes don't like about the modern humanities, which is some aspects of it that are fairly politicized and appeal to some of the newer parts of the humanities, like gender studies and ethnic studies and the like. There are students who are very attracted to those as well, because those also have some insights to offer and can be exciting in their own ways, and they attract a certain set of students. But it's true. I think the humanities are under a lot of pressure in modern universities, and they face some internal pressures trying to understand what they still have to offer, and they face a lot of external pressures of making whether or not they can persuade students and parents that they're a good investment and worth students' time and attention, given how expensive it is to go to college.
Yeah, I recently heard a commissioner on higher education in a Midwestern state say, something to the effect they will begin to regulate, I mean, for lack of a better word, intervene on majors, on how majors are treated at the state universities in their
Yeah.
state on the basis of economic criteria. And I think the room in this was in this where the speech was given was largely approving.
Right.
And as I listened to that, I mean, all sorts of questions came to my mind. One is why would a higher education commission of a state think that it has sort of the precise knowledge to make a call on what's going to be economically profitable at any given point in time, given the dynamic economy that we're in and what makes it. But the other question that came to mind is this person had very laudable goals, had a commercial objective, I think a utilitarian objective, which was rooted in making sure people actually find work, and also make sure people don't waste their time, I think, in their mind. My question, I guess, was, and I think this comes up here, is how did we get to the point where, because I think we get to that point because higher education itself is so unsure of what it's supposed to be doing. And the default logic becomes either kind of a corporatist logic on the right or a social justice logic on the left. And where free speech and academic freedom maneuver or exists in the realm of those two forces, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I worry a lot about this move that's
I
become
mean, you
very
see it.
popular.
You see it
Yeah.
with Republican politicians in particular.
Yes.
I mean, Barack Obama derided art history majors famously, but Marco Rubio said something about which he recently backtracked on, hilariously enough, on welders versus philosophers. The former governor of Texas, Rick, not, but yeah, made the point about, he was really going to limit higher education with regard to humanities or with regard to how well your majors produced. And there's sort of this logic to that obviously works, as you know, but yet it really leaves out what higher education traditionally has thought of itself accomplishing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think this kind of movement does have more traction on the political right, but I don't think there's any reason to imagine it's going to be exclusive to the political right because it does appeal to I think very deep sensibility in American society that universities should be useful. Americans have always wanted things to be useful, and,
You're right,
and
right.
universities are no different. They want it to be useful, and especially when they look at universities and see how expensive they are, then they probably think all the more so it ought to be useful. And a lot of kids are going to college and spending time there and spending a lot of money there, and so from a sort of parental perspective that finds its way into politics as well, then there's a sense that that should be time and money well spent, and students should be getting something out of it. And for a lot of people, what they imagine they're getting out of it is going to be a better job at the end of the day. I do suspect that a lot of those initiatives are very short-sighted. I don't have a lot of faith in government being able to pick what careers are going to be the most profitable 20 years from now, and I don't have any faith in that in the context of industrial policy, and I don't have any faith in it in the context of micromanaging universities. And I find it a little disturbing of trying to, sometimes very directly regulate, but sometimes just nudge students to sort of force them to make particular choices. Right. When I think students should have information available to them about what pursuing certain majors is going to lead to. I think they should have choices about. They should have information about the colleges they're attending and how well those colleges serve their student population and what happens as students go out of it. But then students should be able to make some choices about what it is actually interesting to them, how they want to pursue that down the road, and what kind of careers then they want to follow on the other side. So I worry that we're sort of flattening out what higher education can be, and instead of imagining that it's a diverse place with lots of options and can serve students in very different ways, and students can make lots of different choices about how to pursue them. Instead, we sort of imagine, well, every university ought to be a business school,
Yeah. Well, it seems a crucial.
and do something as vocationally oriented as possible, that's just a very superficial vision of what it is. Universities, I think,
It's a
can be and should be.
superficial vision of the human person.
It is. No, that's right. I think right. I think that's absolutely right. It doesn't account for everything that for the full person and what students are often hungry to do. One thing I like about working with students is that they will encounter ideas and topics that they had never thought of before, and suddenly they see it, and suddenly they're extraordinarily excited by it. And you talk to students who've been out of school for years, sometimes decades, right? And they still think back to these ideas that they encountered when they were in college, and they continue to mull over things that they learned there and ideas that they first started thinking about in that college context. And we should want students to have those kinds of opportunities to encounter, not just how to be an engineer or how to be a financier, but or how to be a computer scientist, but also encounter range of ideas in the humanities and elsewhere in the university. They're going to excite them and enlighten them, and make them think and open doors
Yeah.
for them that might not otherwise be opened.
Yeah, I've thought, somewhere in here is a conversation about cost, and how does one reduce sort of the stakes of higher education for middle class families, or for a student that's thinking, well, I could go here, but I'm going to graduate $50,000 in debt, and that's or something that's quite a lot to take on at the age of 21 or 22. And how does one go about doing that? Seems to me also crucial, but I think it also bears too, because it seems to me, and I think the data bear this out. There's just too many people going to college, and I think part of that is the federal intervention and the loans and the subsidies that go to college campuses, and then the campuses have adjusted, as any public choice theorist would predict, as sort of a welcoming space to grab as much of this welfare as they can, and that, to my mind, also has sort of, in a way, not helped what goes on campus, and I think further distracted from a core academic mission.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and some of the worst stories about students who wind up with really massive student debts and an inability to pay them off very well is often a function of students who don't really know why they're going to college in the first place. They're sort of chasing a brass ring, and they find themselves jumping from program to program, sometimes from school to school, trying to find something that they think will pay off down the road, and meanwhile they're just accumulating a huge amount of debt. And so not only is it probably the case that some students would be better off not going to college and doing something else, but I think for some they'd be better off also taking a step back before they went to college and not rushing into it, so they have enough time to really
Yeah,
think about what it is they're hoping to get out
I
of
think
it
you've I think
and
you've
make some
just
decisions.
you've just helped me understand something I'm puzzling over, which certainly did not exist when I was of college age, which is the gap year.
Yeah,
I hear
yeah.
so much about gap years now. Is this why? Because is this sort of emerged in the last decade or so because of cost and debt ballooning and this sort of thing? I don't know. Your thoughts?
I think it's a little bit of that. I think it's
I
also true that some students are just really stressed out
Yeah.
after. I mean, especially for a lot of these elite institutions, where students have really been running their own rat race all through high school and often before that, trying to get into universities, and they felt a lot of stress and pressure about that, in part because it feels for a lot of people that the stakes are very high, and they need time off then to recuperate a little bit before they start on college. And for some, I think it's genuinely quite useful to have a year to experiencing something else outside of simply studying and being in school, and a chance to mature a little bit before you go to college, a chance to experience other things. And so for some students, taking a gap year really does mean going and
Yeah.
doing serious volunteer work and the like. And students often benefit from that immensely. They come to college then with a different perspective on the world than they would have if they had jumped right in, and that's often extremely useful.
Yeah. Think about this recent episode. It sparked kind of an interesting question in my mind. Maybe it's interesting. I don't know. The Fresno State episode recently. So
Yeah.
Barbara Bush passed away, and this professor said some pretty horrible things about her, and said the Bush family could call her for the suicide hotline, and she gave her own number. All this, and everyone rushed to her. The freedom of this woman to say this, but it sparked a question in my mind, particularly with regard to the way a huge portion of the public sees the university in
Right.
America. And that's so my question to you is on this question, and I think it is about academic freedom, or it will threaten academic freedom in the long run. What's the relationship between the university and its mission, and say in the broader social order that supports it? And even, I know you teach at Princeton, you teach at one of our most elite universities in the country, but yet we saw the endowment tax passed recently.
Right.
No, not a threat, not a confiscatory amount. I think it was like 2% or something on profits. But Interesting, just in that regard, are universities, do they run afoul of being sort of disdained in the eyes of a cross section of Americans, given how they've been operating and these sort of these examples, just these extremist examples on campus. When I think of the Yale example continues to resonate with me, of the housemaster and his wife had sent the
Right.
email about Halloween costumes, and I think how many people saw that video of the students circling that professor and yelling at him. And I said, but I think that's my broader question to you: is universities in the broader social order, do they have an obligation to do anything, or is it really they should try and be as inconspicuous? I mean, Harvey Mansfield has argued this: like, if Harvard is as inconspicuous as possible, hard to do for Harvard, then the public won't
Right.
want to interfere with it. But the minute Harvard thinks it has some sort of missionary uh, purpose with regard to America, that's when the interventions will come.
So I guess I don't think being inconspicuous is necessarily the solution, but it is certainly true that these kinds of episodes, such as the Fresno State thing recently, and the Yale incident a couple of years ago, or the Middlebury incident in which the student shouted down Charles Murray, which got a lot of attention
They once
last
sent one of
year.
their own professors to the hospital, if I remember.
And right, and one of their own professors wound up injured in the protest. That these are disturbing. They certainly put universities in a very bad light. They highlight episodes of people behaving badly, I think, on campus, and the people involved often deserve a great deal of criticism for how they're behaving in those circumstances. And all that makes universities look pretty bad, and moreover, part of our difficulty now, I think, is as well, is that there's a set of political interests that are inclined to want to play those up, and so they take those examples and make them more prominent than they might have been otherwise, but also try to make them as representative of what's happening on universities as a whole. And I still believe that those kinds of incidents are not representative of what happens on a day-to-day basis on university campuses. There's no question that there are people who behave irresponsibly. There are incidents of bad behavior that occur on college campuses, but there's a tremendous number of people teaching and studying on college campuses, and a tremendous number of college campuses across the United States. And so if every bad incident is videotaped and publicized, and we're increasingly living in an age in which almost anything that happens can be videotaped and stuck up on YouTube, then it's not surprising that you'll see a pretty steady stream of embarrassing incidents. But that doesn't change the fact that day in and day out, most campuses are working perfectly fine. Most faculty are behaving in a responsible fashion. Most students are behaving in a responsible fashion. And so I think it's worth paying attention to these kind of incidents, pointing it out when people have behaved badly. I think it's been part of the reason why I was interested in writing this book, is precisely in order to lay out principles to encourage people to behave better and to push back against some of these kinds of incidents. But we also don't want to overstate how representative they are of what happens on universities. And one reason why I think it may not be the right tactic to say, well, therefore universities should also just try to be inconspicuous, is because we also want to call attention to all the good things that happen on university campuses. Universities have value for American society, and universities shouldn't be shy about trumpeting that value. But I do worry that the attention paid to these bad events will tend to overshadow all the good things that universities do. And when I talk to parents, when I talk to alumni about universities, I try in part to remind them about the interesting and valuable and exciting things that are happening on university campuses, as well as these handful of things that are fairly embarrassing and shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Your thoughts, thinking about that endowment tax that passed Congress. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. I saw that in one measure. I mean, as a an attempt to say, you guys produce a ruling class, but it's a
Right.
ruling class that has left out the rest of the country, and that has chosen not to be accountable to the rest of the country. We want to actually limit your product, what you produce, through a tax, and I guess that's related to this broader social question order, particularly as it regards elite schools like yours. Your thoughts on that? I mean, that because that could get very interesting, and I thought it was a mistake for a lot of reasons, but it reminded me of a fairly well-known episode, became well-known, the oral arguments in the Obergefell v. Hodges case, where Obama's Solicitor General suggested they might come after tax-exempt status of religious colleges and universities that didn't, sort of turn over and agree to their arguments for same-sex marriage and their student policies,
Right.
disciplinary policies. And I kind of thought, you really when you start with the right starts intervening on campuses, you really do open up a Pandora's box that the left will easily fill. So I'm curious what you thought of that and how that pertains to your subject.
I thought the endowment tax was very worrisome, and I think in practice the tax that wound up being adopted is at least reasonably modest,
Yeah, yeah.
and there's some options on, I think, to minimize their impact on universities. But I think the instinct to push for it is a very worrisome sign about the political future of universities on college in the United States. And in some ways, it's of a piece with challenges that state universities have faced as states have given less money to state universities over time and sort of defunded public education. This is a different version of a similar phenomenon, in this case of going after private universities and trying to tax their endowments. I think part of it, and part of why I think we ought to be very concerned about it, is that there's just an easy temptation to view universities, wealthy universities, as a piggy bank for legislators. They're looking for ways to fund the programs that they want to fund without having to impose unpopular taxes on individuals. And in an era in which legislators seem incapable of cutting spending and balancing budgets, it's going to be very tempting to say, well, why don't we go after these rich universities, especially if we can paint them as unpopular and wasteful. And again, I think that's just very short-sighted. It's eating the seed corn. Those endowments exist for a reason, and taxing them up in order to spend them on current government expenditures is extraordinarily threatening. But I think it also reflects the sort of perilous state the universities are in right now, in the larger political climate. That a lot of politicians are very skeptical about what universities do, not very trusting about how universities manage their own funds and their own business, and universities need to do a better job then of explaining the nature of university finances, of explaining why they need endowments, of explaining what it is they're doing more generally, so as to try to emphasize both to politicians and to voters that it'd be bad for American society in the long run to try to tax away those endowments that are doing important work on a lot of university
Well,
campuses.
yeah, particularly think about our federal government, which is going to be starved for revenue. I think that's pretty obvious. It was interesting. There was a congressman in California a number of years ago, Xavier Becerra, who proposed taxing endowments, or regulating endowments to direct expenditures towards race, class, gender programs, and so that they're not being
Right.
wasted, in his words. He's now the Attorney General of California, but I thought about that as well, and how this could really be seen as a new store of wealth for the government to manage for either social justice or, again, corporatist goals. I wanted to end just on my own idiosyncrasy here with your book. It was interesting. You made some comments about, to say, 17th or 18th, 19th century colleges in America, and you said they were about more rote learning and memorizing a discipline or a tradition rather than, say, knowledge, instruction, research, thought. And I suppose that's true as far as it goes. But my one counterexample that came to mind is your university, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly James Madison under John Witherspoon. And the political philosophy, the philosophy of learning he gained there, which he brought to bear in, say, the Constitutional Convention, Federalist Papers, among other categories. And it just sort of sparked to my mind what they were actually doing, though, was receiving a tradition.
Yeah.
And that has incredible value, that has incredible worth. And that's one thing it seems to me, I would argue, missing from even from a university that understands itself about knowledge and instruction. There still has to be something in order to question or rebel against. You've got to have a storehouse of tradition. It seems to me Madison was being given that, but was also being given, I think, for the time, cutting edge learning in the Scottish Enlightenment at Princeton.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't want to undersell what universities were doing, and there certainly were examples of individual campuses and individual professors over time who were doing very important work. And in some ways, even I think within the what I think of as being a somewhat limited vision of what universities could do, that nonetheless was a valuable and important mission. I mean, they did understand themselves as trying to communicate critical moral principles and a certain wealth of inherited knowledge to a new generation of students. And in the United States at the time of the founding, in particular, that was seen as critical to creating Republican citizens who could maintain a free society, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. And that was also very valuable. I think part of what changed by the late 19th century was in part the integration of the natural sciences in a much stronger way into universities, the rise of the social sciences within universities, in which there was an increasing sense that not only were we transmitting the inherited store of knowledge from the past to future generations, but we were trying to add to that store of knowledge. We were gaining new insights, and part of what universities ought to be doing then was pushing the boundaries of what we knew, and not simply trying to maintain received wisdom as much as possible. And I don't think that new sort of mission of trying to advance knowledge should necessarily eclipse entirely that old mission of trying to transmit a tradition, especially in the humanities. That old tradition is still there, and it's an important feature of what universities do. It's just that we've sort of layered on top of it this effort, often attached to other disciplines, of trying to expand knowledge as well. And I think some of the approach to thinking about even the humanities and the inherited traditions that we want to continue forward, I think the approach to that changed a little bit too by the 19th and early 20th century of having a more skeptical approach to some of those traditions, of challenging students to not just memorize things, but to really be thinking critically about what they're learning. And that was a useful change as well, even from that perspective. So I think it wasn't a revolution that overturned the old universities and put in place something completely new and different. It was an evolution of what universities were doing, and a reform of what universities are doing in order to take into account new ways of learning and new subjects that were being taught, and new needs of American society. And I think all that was very, very, very valuable.
All right. Keith Whittington, we've been talking about your new book, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.